Hilchos Tumas Meis Perek Echad ve'Esrim. Laws of Corpse Impurity, chapter 21. We have to start with a mazel tov today to Rabbi Weiss, the head shliach of Sherman Oaks. His son got engaged to my second cousin.
To what? Wow.
Yeah.
Second
Who do these people
Sandman.
Are they from Connecticut?
From Connecticut.
And
Her mother's father is my grandfather's brother.
Oh, look at that.
Your grandfather on your mother's side?
No, my father's father and her mother's father are brothers, Lipskier.
Your second cousin?
So now my son and Yona's children, God willing, are going to be third cousins.
Right.
Can you imagine that? It's pretty funny, no?
Yeah. Are they
Two families working together on shlichut,
It's really unique.
not connected in family. We were connected spiritually, you know that? Because my great-grandfather, my father's mother's father, had a big part in Mrs. Weiss's parents coming to Chabad. So spiritually they was connected, yeah, Lapidus. But now also physically connected, because literally they're going to be third cousins. It's crazy.
right?
Wow.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, but it's a big simcha.
Yeah.
A simcha for a shliach is a simcha for the entire community. And the blessing for the family should spread to the entire community for everything that we need. And now let's get to the Rambam. We are within the subject of oihel, the idea that the corpse tumah can spread throughout anything under the same covering or the same roof. And yesterday we kind of began a new section of these laws talking about the matzilim, those things that can save, block the impurity from entering into their confines. Yesterday the Rambam gave us three things. Tzamid pasil. Tzamid pasil means, that's the verse that we see on the screen here, which we'll actually get to better. Maybe we should look at this chart first. Tzamid pasil. Tzamid pasil means a tight covering. If the utensil has stuff in it and it's sealed tightly, it could block the impurity from getting in. Then we had oihel. Oihel means if you have a tent within a tent. So you have a room, and then in the room there's a little covering that's acting as a tent within a tent. Whatever is in that tent blocks the tumah from the corpse from the outside, doesn't spread in. And the third thing is called balua. Balua means absorbed. That was really yesterday's focus, all about the laws of absorption. A dog or an animal swallows something, a person swallows something, a brick is being made and there's a ring inside of it. Those things are all absorbed, and they also don't contract the impurity from the outside. The fact that they're absorbed blocks them, saves them from becoming impure. As we're going to see today, the only one of these three things listed in the Torah explicitly is the tzamid pasil. The tight covering, it's clear in the Torah that a tight covering saves in a tent of a corpse. The other two are learned from what's called a kal v'chomer, a process of logic, a fortiori, that if a law applies to a lenient case, it should certainly apply to a stringent case, as the Rambam will soon tell us. But as a way of introduction and really to understand the principles that are going to guide this entire chapter, let's talk about the other two. The balua was discussed yesterday. The other two, the tzamid pasil and the oihel, the tight covering and the regular tent within a tent, have a very core difference between them. In order for the tzamid pasil, the tight covering, to work, it has to be, as its name implies, actually tight. It has to be a sealed cover. In order for the tent to serve as a blockade within a tent, it just has to be a covering. It doesn't have to be tightly attached to the ground. That's difference number one. It's very important to remember. Difference number two really comes with another point. The law of tzamid pasil, as we're going to learn, does not apply to regular utensils. Regular utensils that are susceptible to becoming impure, classically it would be metal or a wood utensil with a receptacle. Those don't have the laws of tzamid pasil at all. If they're in a room with a corpse, they become impure. Since they themselves become impure, there's no way for them to save things that are inside them. However, pottery utensils, in which tumah can only enter through its airspace, if it's tightly covered, it's a blockade, because the tumah will not penetrate it from the outside, only from the inside, and the inside, the opening to the inside is covered. Additionally, as the Rambam will tell us, other utensils that are not even susceptible to becoming impure, like stone, like utensils formed from dung, not only from the outside, even from the inside they can't become impure, they can never become impure. So also if they're tightly sealed, tzamid pasil applies to them. And then the Rambam says, the truth is that utensils that are not susceptible to becoming impure also can act as an oihel. You don't have to have like a tent covering within the tent. You take a big utensil, a stone utensil, that cannot become impure, and you turn it over, and you place it on the floor covering certain things, it becomes an oil. And it can act as an oil, whereas pottery utensils cannot do that. They can only have the saving method of tzamid pasil, tightly sealed. They cannot act as an oil. So remember this going into the chapter. Regular utensils don't have any way to be savers. Pottery utensils can be a saver by tzamid pasil, tight covering, but they cannot act as an oil. Non-susceptible utensils or other objects that cannot become impure, both if they are tightly sealed, standing upright, and their opening is sealed, they save what's inside them. Also, if they're turned over and they act as an oil, they also will save everything that's inside them. Hope that wasn't too confusing, but it's a very, very important introduction. It's going to carry us really through the entire chapter. So first, in Halacha Aleph, the Rambam will examine the source in the Torah for the concept of these methods of saving in a tent with a corpse. Halacha Aleph, minayin l'tzamid pasil shematzil ba'el Meis. How do we know that a tzamid pasil, a tight covering, by the way, the words are tzamid, means a covering, pasil means tightly. So a tight covering, how do we know that it saves whatever is in it when it's in a tent with a corpse from becoming impure? Shenemar, because it says in the verse in Chumash Bamidbar, which talks about the whole law of corpse impurity, it says over there, v'chol kli fasuach, any open utensil asher ein tzamid pasil alav, that doesn't have a tight covering over it, tamehu, becomes impure. By implication, what does that mean? Ha yesh tzamid pasil alav. But if there is a tight covering over the utensil, tahar, then it's pure. The tight covering serves as a blockade, as a saving mechanism from letting the impurity inside. Now, the Rambam examines a nuance in the verse. What does the Torah say? Every word in the Torah is exact. It says, v'chol kli fasuach, every open utensil. Why add the word open? Just say any utensil that doesn't have a tight covering over it. I'll obviously understand that it means it's an open utensil. Why say the word open? The word open, says the Rambam, teaches us what type of utensil we're talking about. Do we learn from tradition that the verse over here is only referring to pottery utensils. It's a utensil which typically only becomes impure when it's open because the impurity goes through its opening. A regular metal utensil, open or not, the metal walls themselves can contract the impurity. Open utensil means it's a type of utensil which has to be open in order to become impure. Lefichach, therefore, im haya pischei sasum umukaf tzamid pasil, if it's opening, which is typically the way the impurity enters, if that opening was sealed and surrounded by a tight covering, hitzil al kol shebaseicha, it saves everything inside of it. Everything biblically, rabbinically, as we'll see, only food and drink, but and other types of utensils, but at least biblically, it's everything. So from the extra word open, we learn that we're talking about pottery utensils. So to return over here, regular utensils don't have the law of tightly sealed, pottery utensils do. Now, by extension, says the Rambam, kal v'chomer, we can draw a logical kal v'chomer and say, l'chol ha'kelim she'ein mekablin tuma, that any utensil which isn't even susceptible to becoming impure. So for sure, she'yatzilu b'tzamid pasul, they can for sure save if they're tightly covered. Because again, what's the logic? Follow the reasoning. A regular utensil which could become impure from its outside, coverings won't help because the tumah will come to the sides. A pottery utensil, the sides are blocked, but the opening is vulnerable. Once you cover the opening, now you're good. If the utensil can't become impure to begin with, certainly if you covered it tightly, it would be good. Veheim, what are examples of non-susceptible objects? Klei glalim, any utensils made from animal dung. Klei avanim, utensils made from stone. Klei adama, utensils made from earth before they've been fired in a kiln. Once they're fired, they're called klicheres, pottery. But before that stage of firing, just raw clay, raw earth. They can also have utensils formed from that's called klei adama. Uklei atzmes hadog va'oirei, utensils made from bones of fish or fish skin. Va'atzmes ha'oif, bird bones, which the Rambam said in chapter 6, don't contract impurity. Uklei eitz haba b'mida, wooden utensils which come in oversized. They can hold 40 sa'ah in their volume of liquid. Unisarim shal eitz shehin pshutin ve'enan kelim, or wooden boards that are completely flat, they're not receptacle-like. The golne klei matches, and unformed slabs or blocks of metal. Once metal is formed into a utensil, it becomes a keli. But before that, it's called golme, unformed metal utensils. Kol elu matzilin betzamid pasil. All of these save with a tight covering. So again, to review, regular utensils don't work tightly sealed. Pottery utensils and non-susceptible utensils work with a tzamid pasil. Then the Rambam says that's all we have in the Torah. In the Torah, we only have the first of the three methods that we mentioned yesterday, only the tight covering. But im hadvarim, If things that are in a utensil but it's surrounded with a tight covering get saved, kal v'chomer. By extension, we can learn again with a kal v'chomer libluyin, for things that are literally absorbed, a ring absorbed in a brick, a ring absorbed in a dog. For sure, those are saved. V'lakelim shetachas ha'olim, and we also can learn for sure to utensils that are under a tent. Now, literally, these words would refer to the method of oil that I mentioned before. When you have a tent, inside of a tent, whatever is inside the tent gets saved. But as Reb Chaim Halevi on the Rambam points out, that's obvious. The fact that an oil within an oil serves as a blockade isn't derived from a kal v'chomer. That's derived straight from the Torah. Rather, says Reb Chaim, the Rambam is referring to this thing over here, that non-susceptible utensils can act as an oil. If you turn them over, they can act as an oil, and now any utensils under them will also be considered blocked from impurity. Point is, we now have three methods of saving. Tzamid pasul is the one explicit in the Torah, tight covering. Balua, absorbed. Oihel, a tent within a tent. The first one is explicit, the other two are derived by kal v'chomer. And now that Rambam gives us a very big difference between the tzamid pasul and the oihel, which I mentioned in the introduction. Ma bein oyelim lekelim shematzilin mitzamid pasul. What's the difference between the way a tent within a tent blocks the tumah and a utensil with a tight covering blocks the tumah? Shehakelim einan matzilin ela b'tzamid pasul. Utensils have to be actually tightly covered. Whereas something which is acting as a tent within a tent doesn't have to have a layer that's attaching it to the ground. Doesn't have to have a tight covering. Just the fact that it's a covering already blocks the tumah from getting into it. Halacha Beis, we get an interesting example, application of this. Mashpech shekafahu. Let's say you have a funnel, and the commentaries say we're talking about a stone funnel, so it goes into the category of non-susceptible utensils. And you turned it over on its bigger side, so now it's acting like an oil. Matzil b'kisui. It saves just by being a covering. Doesn't need to be a tzamid pasul. No need for a tight covering. Just the fact that it's sitting over the food and drink in this case saves it. What's the novelty? We just said any keli that's not susceptible to impurity can act as an oil. The novelty is the hole on this side. Even though at the other end it has a very small hole, we ignore that hole and we just treat it as if it's closed. Halacha Gimel, says the Rambam, what I told you in the introduction, Kol hakelim hamatzilin b'tzamid pasul. Any utensil which can save with a tight covering, im hayu bahen tefach al tefach arun tefach. If they also met the halachic criteria of an oil, they were a tefach wide, a tefach long, and a tefach deep, ukfan al pm al aretz, and you turn them over on the ground, afal pi shalei meidach b'tzamid pasul min hatzdadin, even though you didn't seal it off with a tight covering from the outside, on the sides, attached to the ground, harei elu matzilin kol ma shetachteyan ad hatohaim. They cease acting as a vessel, they start acting as an oihel, and they save everything under them all the way to the depths, because they're like a tent, and a tent can save even if it's not tightly sealed. Unless it was pottery. Pottery cannot act as an oil. Only non-susceptible utensils can act as an oil. So much so, says the Rambam. Let's take a look at this slide, and I have to apologize, this should not be metal, this should be a non-susceptible pot. So we'll imagine as if it's stone, okay? So you can see a stone pot, if it's bent over food and drink, just has to be bent over, no need for a tzamid pasul. A pottery utensil that was turned over on its side, on its mouth, will not save as an oil. It won't even save if you seal it with a tight covering at the point where the mouth meets the ground. Ketzad, says the Rambam, chavis shekfuya al piyah. You have a pottery barrel turned over on its mouth. Even though you sealed it off with mud all around on the sides, whatever is under it is going to become impure from the corpse that's in the room. Why not? I understand you just told me that it can't act as an oil, but now I sealed it off with a tight covering. Isn't that a tzamid pasul? Tzamid pasul works for pottery utensils. Says the Rambam, examine the verse closely. Shenemar, it says, tzamid pasul olav. The tight covering has to be on it, on its rim, on its top. V'lo tzamid pasul al gaboy, not the tight covering on its back. On its back, notice when you put a pottery utensil on the floor, the covering is not going on top of its rim, the covering is going around it, on its outside. Or, as some commentaries interpret this Rambam, tzamid pasil alav, on top of it means the utensil must be under the covering. Here, the covering is under the utensil, right? Because the utensil is on top and the covering is on bottom. Either way, the tzamid pasil doesn't count. It doesn't meet the criteria of being a tzamid pasil. So we ignore it. And what do we have now? A pottery utensil turned on its mouth. A pottery utensil turned on its mouth cannot act as an oil. Although, says the Rambam, we do have a special exception. Hidbik piha lakoisel. If you didn't put it to the floor, you put it to the wall. Not sure why you do this, but you took a pottery utensil and you stuck its mouth to the wall. Umercha min hatzdadim, and you did seal it off on the sides. This is considered tzamid pasil alav, the tight covering on top of it, perhaps because of this part that's actually on top of the utensil. And matzelas al kol mashe b'soicha v'al kol shekenegda b'koisel. It saves everything inside of it and anything opposite in the wall. If the wall were to be, let's say, hollow and there was stuff in the wall, the corpse in the room will not affect anything in this pottery utensil, anything in it in the wall. If you would not seal it on the sides, though, pottery utensil, eina matzeles, it wouldn't save because then all it is an oil. She'ein kli chedes matzel mishum oil kamesha be'arnu. A pottery utensil cannot act as an oil, as we explained. But any other utensil, the non-susceptible utensils, this one again, which is supposed to be stone, that would typically save were it to be tightly covered. If their mouths were stuck to the wall of the home, we revert to their status. They can save even without a tight covering, because they save in this scenario as an oil. So the Rambam even himself kind of presented a little bit out of order, but we can always revert back to this chart to help us understand what the Rambam is saying. Whenever we're dealing with pottery utensils, you have to examine. If it's tightly sealed and it meets the criteria of tzamid pasil, then it acts as a tight covering and it saves whatever is inside of it. Once it's acting as an oil, a pottery utensil doesn't work anymore. A non-susceptible utensil, whether it's tightly sealed, standing upright, or it's turned over and acting as an oil in any form, it works. And it works to save whatever is inside it. However, the Rambam clarifies that in this case, when the keli is attached to the wall, we do have to examine and make sure that the utensil itself meets the criteria of an oil. Lefichach, therefore, tzarich sheyeh b'doifen hakli tefach. The wall of the utensil has to be a tefach wide, protruding out of the wall. She'ein hakelim matzilin im dafnes oyalim ad sheyeh lehen doifen tefach. Because utensils that are working in tandem with the wall of an oil cannot be a savior unless they have a wall, a tefach. Now, there's no novelty there really, because every oil has to have a tefach. What the Rambam is saying is that, as he's going to explain in a second, the utensil itself has to carry that entire tefach. Therefore, you can't have a mix of a protrusion from a wall and this keli. Take a look at this case. Hoya lakli doifen chatzi tefach. Let's say the utensil only had a short wall, a wall of half a tefach. And out of the wall is coming a protrusion that's also half a tefach. So here we have a utensil working in tandem with the wall of an oil, but it's only bringing to the table half a tefach. It's relying on the half a tefach that's protruding from the wall. If you stuck one to the other, even though in total we have a tefach of space, a total oil, this does not save anything inside it. If there's a corpse in the room, the impurity will enter whatever's inside there, until you have a tefach from one place. That's the novelty. When the Rambam is saying that a keli that works in tandem with the wall needs to have a tefach, it means it needs to have a tefach coming from one place. Either the utensil is providing the full tefach, or, and we'll see later, there could be a case of protrusion that provides the full tefach. But there has to be a full tefach creating that oil coming only from one space. At any rate, what do we have? We have the law that classically a utensil attached to the wall can serve as an oil and save whatever is inside it. Says the Rambam Halacha Daled, Keshem shematzilin mibifnim, im dafnes oil, the same way a utensil from the inside of a home will work together with the wall to create an oil and save whatever is inside it. Kach matzilin chutz la'oil im smachan la'oil. The same utensil, if attached to the outside of an oil, will also work in tandem with the outside wall of the oil and save whatever is inside of it. Shahadei ha'oil nasa kisui mikol makayim. Because the wall of the tent, the wall of the structure, is serving as part of the cover. At any rate, who cares if it's on the inside or on the outside? It works. What would be an example of this? Ketzad. So, here you see an example where a slight change in the text has people mistranslating the Rambam. In my Rambam that I'm using, it says Kli Mecham, Mem Ches Mem, which is translated as a samovar. But that's a mistake. You look in all the earlier authentic texts of the Rambam, it's kli mehem. Kli mehem means a utensil of one of them meaning the non-susceptible type. Stone, dung, earth, kli mehem. That's how you must read this word. A utensil from the list of non-susceptible utensils. Sheyesh lo doifen tefach, that has a wall, a tefach high. Now I'm using the picture from the Art Scroll Mishnah where they use a wicker basket as an example of this utensil. This is a utensil which is kli mehem. It's on the list of them, non-susceptible utensils. It has a wall of a tefach. Shehinichai al gabe yesedes, which, number one, you rest it on top of pegs. It will have to be a tefach raised from the ground. Otherwise, it's tumar tzutza, it's cramped impurity, and the impurity will spread upwards and downwards as we've had multiple times. So you put it on pegs, chutz la'oyel, outside of the tent. This is a wall of a home. The corpse is inside the home, past the wall. This is the outside of the wall. V'samach piv ledoifen ha'oyel. You bring the mouth of the utensil close to the wall of the tent. The commentaries debate the meaning of this. In the picture which the Rambam drew himself in his commentary to the Mishnah, it seems that the mouth of the basket was tilted upwards, literally attached to the wall. As in the other picture, on the inside, the mouth attached to the wall. Here too, we should correct this, and the wicker basket should be raised to be attached to the wall. Other commentaries say that no, in the outside case, it could even be in this scenario. As long as the wall of the wicker basket is touching the outside wall, even if it's not actually resting against it, it still classifies to meet the halacha that we're about to mention. From the Rambam here, it seems like the first way, v'samach piv, right? He says he puts his mouth, the mouth of the utensil next to the wall. So imagine that this wicker basket is tilted upwards, okay? V'hoisa tuma tachtav. And there's a source of impurity under this utensil. As here, the piece of corpse is under the utensil. Kelim shebeseichei tahirim. The fact that this utensil is acting in tandem with the wall, even though it's outside, but utensils are able to act in tandem with an outside wall, now they work together to save any utensils that are inside the wicker basket. Because they're acting as an oil, and the corpse will not penetrate that oil. But this wall has to be the wall of a regular home, a wall that was built to be a protective structure. If it was leaning on a wall of a courtyard or a wall of a garden, that doesn't work together to save. They're not a wall for a regular structure. They're a wall for a garden, a wall for a courtyard. And therefore, were this to be the wall of a garden or a courtyard and this scenario played out, any utensils inside the wicker basket in our picture would be impure, because they have become an oil over a piece of corpse, and nothing is blocking them. The tuma penetrates, and they all become impure. Halacha hey. Okay, this halacha, we're going to have two variations in the commentaries how to explain it. Let's first learn the case, and then by examining the reasonings, we'll see how there's two different cases. Koira sheyesh ba poiseach tefach. We have a beam. This is a side view of the beam. We'll get to that in a second. First, we're looking at the beam here. This is a beam, sheyesh ba poiseach tefach. It has a width of a tefach. Once it has a width of a tefach, it's acting as an oil. It will act as a halachically significant means to spread any impurity under it. V'hinesuna mikaisel lekaisel. This is an important part of the case. It's stretched from wall to wall. It's touching both walls, which makes it classify as dafnois oihalim, the walls of a tent. So whatever laws we just said about sticking a utensil to the wall of a tent on the inside and having it work together, or the outside of the wall, this will also apply to the beam. The beam is considered to be an extension of the wall, and now this utensil, which we're going to get to in a second, is going to be acting in tandem with the beam. So nesuna mikaisel lekaisel, v'tuma tachteha, and there's impurity under it. You don't see it in the picture, but imagine over here, there's a piece of corpse under the beam. Ukdeira tluya min hakaira, and there's a pot hanging from the beam. Now I'm going to interpret the pot as being a type of pot that's not susceptible to impurity. It's a stone pot, okay? For example. V'hoisa hakaira, noigas befi hakdeira kula, the beam is directly touching the mouth of the entire pot, umechasa oisa, and it's covering it. So here we have the side view. Imagine this pot is literally stuck to the beam. I know here it says less than a tefach. We'll get to that in a second. For this case, we're going to imagine that it's fully stuck. So the pot is completely sealing the beam is completely sealing the pot. This is a case now of the pot acting in tandem with the beam. Kelim shabakdeira tahirim. So now, any utensils inside the pot are not going to be affected by the corpse, even though the beam, being an oil, should transmit the tumah to them, right? Let's say you had a corpse over here and some utensils over here. They're both under the same oil. The corpse transmits the impurity to the oil brings it here and makes the utensils impure. It should do the same, seemingly, to any utensils in the pot. But since the pot is stuck to the beam, that's a good oil. The keli is acting in tandem with the dafnei oilim, saving the utensils inside them. Shaharei hutzlu bekisu oil lohem, because they've been saved by the covering of the oil that's acting, right? The beam is called the oil. So the covering of the oil that's acting to save them is helping the utensils in the pot. Whereas the imloy haya hakdeira, pi hakdeira mechusa bakaira, ela beineim revach, if the mouth of the pot was not fully covered, there's a space between them, and the space could be any space, as many commentaries understand it, even less than a tefach. Once there's space, kol masha bakdeira tamei, whatever is in the pot is going to become impure. V'hakdeira atzma tmeya, the pot itself will become impure, because at this point there's room for the impurity to pass through under the rest of the oil of the beam, and it transmits the impurity to whatever is under it, including the utensils in the pot and the pot itself. That is one way to understand this halacha, meaning that we've looked at the beam as an oil. The utensils were saved because of an oil within the oil. Right? There's a covering within the tent. The pot is stuck to the wall. And if there's no oil, because it's open, then the utensils are not saved. Now, others say that the pot, whenever you have the word kedera, it means cheres. It means pottery. So we're talking about a pottery utensil, not a pot that isn't susceptible to impurity at all. It's a pottery pot. Now, a pottery pot, we just learned a couple of times already, cannot act as an oil within an oil. It doesn't save when it's simply a tent. Therefore, other commentaries suggest that we're talking about tzamid pasil. Even though he doesn't say it, we're talking about where it was actually sealed to the beam with a tight covering. And that's the reason why it works. As we had in the case of the inside wall, that Rambam said, if the kli cheres is tied to the wall with a tzamid pasil, with a layer of mud from around it, it works as a savior. Here too, the pot is tied or is attached, sealed to the beam with a sealant all around. The question for these commentaries is, then why does the Rambam make the point to mention that the beam is a tefach? Even if it wasn't a tefach, seemingly. The fact that it's attached by tzamid pasil should make a savior. The commentaries explain, the tefach is needed for a different reason. If the beam is not a tefach, then even if the corpse is sitting over here, it wouldn't transfer to the pot, because an oil only works if it's a tefach. Whereas according to the first commentary that was saying that the whole point is to make the beam into an oil, so of course it had to be a tefach. Here it's kind of like a side technicality. In order for the tumah to spread from the corpse to the pot, the beam had to be a tefach. But the main point is not the oil element, but the tzamid pasil element. Indeed, these commentaries struggle a little bit with why the Rambam uses the words Shaharei hutzlu b'kisui ha'oil lahem, that they were saved by the covering of the oil. That's not what we care about. It isn't the oil that's doing the saving, it's the tzamid pasil that's doing the savings. They struggle with it. See there, I think it's the Chas de David on the Tosefta. They have a lengthy analysis of that. Anybody watching online that wants to weigh in on this and has a little interpretation, I'd love to know. But that's an aside, just as a by the way. Halacha Vav, the Rambam returns to the concept that non-susceptible utensils can save whatever is under them inside the room with a corpse. You have a pit inside a home. V'tuma babayis v'kelim babur. There's a source of impurity in the home. Here's a corpse, and there are utensils in the pit. Im haya mechusa b'neser chalak. If the pit was covered with a flat wooden board, oy b'kli hamatzil sheyesh loy doifen tefach, or with any other utensil which could serve as a savior, as long as it has a wall that's a tefach to create the oil element. Harei kol ma shebabar tar. So whatever's in the pit is pure. This case is adding that even what's deeper in the floor. Before we're talking about a classic case, a pot on the floor. Here it's a pit, and you covered the pit. Whatever's in the pit is also saved. Let's say the pit had a rim, a constructed rim around it, going upwards at a tefach tall. So now, bein shekisahu b'kli hamatzil sheyesh loy doifen, bein sheloy hoysa loy doifen, if you cover it with a utensil that would save, let's say it's a stone pot, but it wasn't so tall. The utensil was short. It didn't have a wall of a tefach. Harei zematzil, it would do the saving. Shaharei yesh loy doifen tefach mimokim acher, because there's a wall of tefach from a different place, from the constructed rim. as long as something, either the protrusion or the keli, has a wall on its own of a tefach, the oil is created, and whatever is inside it is saved. Others change the wording mimakim acher to mimakim echad. It has a wall of a tefach from one place, coming at least from one of the two, unlike in the other case. Remember, we had this protrusion, where it's coming from two places, half a tefach from here, half a tefach from here. Here, the doifen of a tefach is coming from one place, just from the constructed rim. Halacha Zayin, the Rambam examines a bit of a particular case in relationship to this concept of oil within an oil. You have a chadus. Chadus is a circular structure above ground. So think of what a pit is. A pit is a hole in the ground. A chadus is like a pit above ground. You've built up walls surrounding an area. It was a common structural element in those days called a chadus. In the Mishnah it's called a dus. The Rambam calls it chadus. Chadus habonoi b'toich habayis. A circular, empty structure, hollow structure built into your home. Umenoira b'soichai. Very particular case. There's a candelabrum sitting inside of it. V'haperach shela yoytzei umechase pi hachadus. And the lip under where the cups are, the word perach literally means a flower, because they used to have the lips of the cups shaped in flower-like extensions, kind of like by the menorah in the Holy Temple. That's the perach. So the lip of it is extending and covering the edge of the chadus. Okay? This is a colorized picture. Here's a regular black and white. Maybe you can appreciate it better. You see the lip is coming over the walls of the structure. This is just 2D. Here it's in 3D. Okay, so we have the menorah. The lip is covering the sides of the structure. Then you go and you cover the entire circular structure with an upside down utensil that works to save in a tent. Okay, that's our stone pot again. I know it looks metal. We're going to imagine that it's stone. It's now covering the mouth of the chadus. But because the lip of the candelabrum is sticking out, so actually the rim of the pot is not flush with the rim of the chadus. It's actually interrupted. Again, I'll go back to this picture so you can see it clearly. Here's the stone pot on top. There's a little interruption that's being filled up by the lip of the candelabrum, but technically, if you would remove the candelabrum, this thing would land directly on the rim. So it's as big as the rim of the structure, but it's not flush with it. Okay? There it is. So now there's a corpse in the home, and the question is the menorah okay? Does the corpse impurity enter this, or is the stone pot protecting it? Royan, we have to examine. If the candelabrum could be removed, and the saving utensil would still stand, because it's as wide as the rim of the structure. So if it would fall down, it would fall right onto the walls of the circular chadus. Then we consider the candelabrum as if it's not there, and it saves whatever is in the chadus. Additionally, the kelim shebein sfas hakli usfas hachadus tohirim ada tohim. Any utensils that are between the lip of the stone pot on top and the lip of the chadus, all the way to the depths, are pure. Meaning, the commentaries explain, if the walls of the chadus were hollow and you can fit stuff in there, or the ground under the walls of the chadus was hollow and you fit stuff in there, the fact that this pot is on top saves everything all the way down to the depths. And the candelabrum itself is also pure, even though the lip of the menorah, again, is visible between the two. But why? Because it's not needed. Had it not been there, the stone pot would land beautifully and cover the chadus. But if not, let's say, the stone pot was a bit smaller than the diameter of the chadus, and had you removed the menorah, it would actually fall right into the chadus. It isn't a really good covering. So then, hakol tamei, then everything is impure. Why? Even though the stone pot usually acts as a good oil, but since it's relying on the menorah, and the menorah is a regular utensil, and I remind you the chart in the beginning of the chapter, a regular utensil cannot act as an oil. It doesn't work as an oil to save anything from to save the corpse from entering inside of it. And therefore, in the case where the stone pot is narrower than the chadus and would fall in, had the menorah not been there, it makes everything impure. Halacha ches. Hachadus habonoi b'seich habayis. Same case. You have the circular structure built in the home, ukli hamatzil nason al piv, with a saving utensil on top of it, a stone pot on top of it. V'hoisa tuma bein sfas hakli usfas hachadus. And there's a source of impurity right between the rims. corpse flesh right there. Now, it's obviously not sticking out. I just drew that way to show you what's going on. But imagine the corpse flesh is literally stuck between the rim of the pot and the rim of the chadus. Or it's inside the chadus. Habayis tameh. The house is impure. Till now, we're talking about where the corpse was outside and want to know if it enters inside. But if the corpse is on the inside, then, as we've seen multiple times before, an oil within an oil can't act as a blockade. The tumah will depart. A tent within a home doesn't stop tumah from exiting. It stops tumah from entering, but not leaving, as we explained. If the impurity was in the home, and now the commentaries explain, we're referring to also a pretty specific case. The tumah is in the home, but the walls of the chadus are pretty wide, and the pot, while it covers the entire empty space of the chadus, it doesn't cover all the walls. So it's just leaning over the rim, safe and sturdy, but isn't extending all the way to cover all the walls. So now, kelim shebekosle hachadus. What do we do with the utensils in the walls of the chadus? Let's say this chadus is very thick, so you had a little hollow space, and you stuck a little pot in there for storage. If you think about it, it's not being protected by the stone pot. You draw a line upwards, the rim of the stone pot hasn't reached there. It's only reached just covering the inner space, but not the actual thickness of the walls. So then, what do we do with these utensils? If they're in their own halachic space, the cubicle which they're in is a handbreadth by a handbreadth by a handbreadth, to hide them, they're pure. They're in their own oil. An oil within an oil is saved. But if not, then they're part of the larger oil of the room. And the same way the corpse tumah spreads to everywhere in the room, it will also spread to this, because it's not being protected. Only the inside is being protected by the stone pot, but not this area of the walls of the chadus that's outside the perimeter of this pot's protection. What if the walls of the chadus were wider than the home? Now, how do you have a circular structure in a home wider than the home itself? So the commentaries explain it means that the circular structure led to a little underground cubicle. Okay, this is the chadus as it comes into the home, but if you jump in, there's actually a huge basement, and the walls of the basement extend past the outer walls of the actual home. So we're looking at an underground cutaway. Understand? The chadus rises into the home, and if you go down, it gets much wider than the home. So then says the Rambam, ben kach u ben kach tohirim. If there's stuff stuck in the walls of the chadus, they're always pure, even if they're not being protected by the pot that's on top of them. Because now it's clear that the walls of the chadus aren't considered part of the walls of the home. The same way the chadus saves whatever is inside of it, it will also save whatever is in its walls, because they're completely on their own compartment. Now, we're going to be dealing with, for the next couple of halachas, an oven. Let's remember what a halachic oven looks like. Okay, this is relevant for the next case, but just to show you. An oven was always wider on the bottom, narrow on the top. That's how the heat would stay in there. And that's how they baked bread in these types of ovens. So the Rambam reminds us, Kvar be'arnu, we already explained. Shahatanur hayasham. Once an oven is old meaning it's been used once, brought to a level of heat that's fit to cook a sponge cake, I think the Rambam mentions, sufganim. It's already been fired up once. Hareu kechala kelim. It now has the status of keli, of utensil, regular utensil. Shehin mevi'in esatuma ve'ena nasan oilim. A regular utensil which spreads impurity. And again, I return this just to make a point. It's a regular utensil. It cannot act as an oil. Even if it's covered nicely, it will not act as a proper covering. And therefore it will not save whatever is inside of it, unless it was surrounded by a tight covering, like any other utensil which saves. Right here, the Rambam is referring now to a pottery oven. Because obviously if it's a regular oven, even if it's tightly sealed, it doesn't work. But if it's a pottery oven, which was common in those days, clay ovens, they don't act as an oil, but they could be tzamid pasul, they could save with a tight covering. That's all if it's an old oven. We also explained, a new oven, before it's been used once, is not considered a keli. It's considered to be a non-susceptible object. It could become an oil. Therefore, it will save whatever is inside it, if it's just simply covered. Even without a tight covering, like a regular oil. So a huge difference. A new oven can act as an oil. all it needs is a covering. An old oven cannot be an oil, it needs a tight covering at Samid Pasil. The kisoi hatanor hu anikra srida. Just a term, halachic term, the covering for an oven. There was a plate they used to use to cover the oven. It's called a srida. That's the Hebrew name for it. Srida is the cover for the oven. So now let's consider a case where an old oven and a new oven overlap, because they have different laws governing them. What happens if they come together? Tanur yashan b'seicha chadash. You have an old oven inside a new oven. The commentaries explain you had an old oven, it was kind of getting old, worn down, so you build this new oven around it. And now you have a new surrounding the old. The old is inside the new. Remember, the old cannot be an oil. The new could be an oil. Usrida al pia chadash. The covering is covering the new oven. However, v'harei hakisui nishan al pia tanur hayashan. It's also leaning on the older oven. As the commentaries explain it, it's off to a side. It's not big enough to cover the entire new oven. It's covering one wall or one part of the wall of the new oven, and it's also leaning on the inside on the old oven. So the question is, let's remember, if it was covering fully the new oven only needs to be covered. It doesn't need to be sealed, tight covering. It already saves everything. But if we're relying on the old oven for support, the cover doesn't work on the old oven. So therefore, Ryan, we have to examine. If you would take away the old oven, the cover would cave in, lo hitzil. So the covering is not working for the new oven. It cannot save. And if there's a corpse around, the corpse impurity will go in, it will not be saved, everything in it will become impure. But if you would remove the old oven and the covering would not fall down, that means it's relying firmly on the new oven holding it up, which the new oven only needs to be covered, doesn't need a tight covering, hakol tar. Then everything is pure. It's wonderful, because it's acting as a proper oil, as a new oven could. What if it's the opposite? The new oven is inside the old oven. So we're flipping now. Inside is the new oven, outside is the old oven. And the covering is placed over the old one. Now, we know that that's not going to work for the old one. I get it. But here's the novelty. If the new oven on the inside is less than a tefach away from the covering on top, we're going to isolate the part of the cover that's on the new oven and save everything in the new oven. Whatever's in the new oven is pure, as if the covering is only placed on it. We're going to ignore the outer part that's covering the older oven. We're going to consider it as if it's just covering the newer oven. And granted, the covering will not work for the older oven. The Tumas will get into there, but it won't get into the new oven, which only requires a simple covering. By the way, why don't we require that it should be literally flush with the cover? Why even less than a tefach of space is fine? Because of lavud. The principle in halacha, lavud means attached. If something is close enough, we consider that the airspace is closed in. So even if it's less than a tefach, then it's considered closed in. If it's more than a tefach, then it's too far away. We can't consider the new oven covered. Less than a tefach is fine. By the way, in the last case, when it was the old oven inside the new oven, there we didn't differentiate between how far away it is. Because the whole idea is that whatever element is acting as an oil, that's what needs to be covered. So in the case where the plate wouldn't fall had the old oven been removed, that means it's firmly lying on the new oven. Doesn't matter how far the old oven is. The fact is that the outer oven, the new oven, which is needed to be an oil, is fully covered. So we're good. When the new oven is inside, it has to be close enough to actually be considered covered. If it's too far and not considered covered, then it doesn't have the saving capacity. Halacha Yud, another law related to oven covers. Srida shel cheres sheyesh la safa. We have a pottery cover, and it has a rim. Not so clear in the picture, but imagine that it has a rim rising all along its perimeter. So it's somewhat of a receptacle. It's not a flat plate. It's a little bit rising wall around it. V'hi oidefes al pi atanur, and it's sticking out over the rim of the oven. Unlike the previous case of the plate, which was directly covering the hole, this is a little bit wider than the oven's hole. Umukefes tzamid pasil, and it is surrounded, it is sealed to the oven by a tight covering. So it meets the criteria for pottery utensil, tzamid pasil. The novelty here is that we're going to actually divide the plate into two. Afilu haisatuma tachteha el gaba, even if there's a source of impurity under it or on top of it, in which case the tumas should spread everywhere Hakol Tameh, everything is indeed impure. Aval Keneged Avirei Shel Tanur Tahar. But the part opposite the airspace of the oven, where under here it's layered, it's sealed with a thick covering, we isolate that inner circle and we say anything opposite that space is pure. Hoisa Tuma Keneged Avirei Shel Tanur. If the source of impurity was directly above the airspace of the oven, literally aligned with the open mouth, mikenegde ad l'rakia tameh, only upwards is impure. V'kol ma shebeseichei tahar, whatever is inside of it is pure, because it's mukaf tzamid pasil. And even though there's an outer part of the rim, we ignore that. We only look at the part that's actually covering the oven. Halacha Yud Aleph, the Rambam concludes with another law related to tzamid pasil. K'deira shekfa al pi chavis. You have a pottery barrel and you have a pottery pot. You bent the pottery pot on top of the pottery barrel, umeirach dafneseha im chavis, and you sealed the walls to the barrel. Tzamid pasil, beautiful. Here says the Rambam, matzeles al kol mashe b'seicha. It saves everything inside of it. And whatever is between it and the walls of the barrel. In other words, tzamid pasil doesn't just mean that one utensil is covered. It could even be a covering or a sealant between two utensils. And that works as a savior. However, interestingly, let's say you didn't put it upside down. Let's say you put it upright. Pottery pot on top of a pottery barrel. Umeirach, and even if you sealed it all around, eina matzeles. This sealant will not work as a savior. Because think what happens. A pottery pot, here's the corpse. The corpse is going to enter the airspace of the pot. The tuma will make this pottery pot impure. And an impure utensil cannot be a savior. If it itself is impure, it can't be a blocker. And therefore, in this case, even though this barrel happens to be sealed wonderfully, the tuma is going to enter this pot and also enter the barrel under it and make all its contents impure.